The train screeched to a halt under the scorching Texas sun. Dust swirled in the heat as the German prisoners leaned forward, squinting through slatted wooden windows, bracing for the crack of rifles, the bark of orders, the stench of another miserable cage. But what they saw instead stopped their breath. No barbed wire, no watchtowers looming like gallows, just a row of curved, silver-roofed huts gleaming under the sky. Quonset huts, the Americans called them. One man whispered, "Where are the fences?" Another laughed nervously, mistaking it for some trick, a staging area before the real prison. But no orders came, no chains. The guards gestured calmly, even politely, and the men were led not into cells, but into barracks with beds, blankets, and windows that opened. It felt like a hallucination. And for a young German radio operator named Felix, this would be the beginning of a captivity stranger and more transformative than anything he had imagined. A prison that unraveled his beliefs, one gentle contradiction at a time. The train door creaked open like the lid of a long-forgotten box, and with it came the blinding wash of sun. Felix blinked hard, raising a hand to shield his eyes. He had imagined Texas would be rough and dry, but nothing prepared him for the vastness of it. The sky stretched wider than any he'd seen in Europe, a ceilingless dome of pale blue that seemed to hum with silence. The air was thick with heat and something else, something faintly sweet. Pecan wood, burning in some far-off stove, mingled with the sterile scent of fresh soap. It didn't smell like prison. It didn't smell like war. It smelled clean. He stepped down onto the packed dirt, boots crunching gravel, half expecting to be shoved or barked at. But no blows came. The guards, young, clean-shaven Americans in khaki uniforms, stood with rifles slung casually, not raised. One gestured, two fingers pointed toward a wooden path, not shouting but nodding, as if directing guests to a wedding tent. Felix waited for someone to snarl. No one did. The heat pressed against his skin like a hand, heavy but not cruel. The camp was eerily quiet. No dogs, no sirens, just wind and the low hum of insects in the grass. He followed the others, boots trailing the dust kicked up by the line ahead, until the buildings came into view. They weren't guard towers or concrete bunkers. They were curved, gleaming structures, Quonset huts, the Americans called them. Like half-barrels laid on their sides, metal ribs arcing over smooth tin roofs. Their shapes looked almost playful, like something from a children's drawing, not the cages he had braced for. Rows of them lined a neat gravel grid, evenly spaced, each with a narrow door, a chimney, and rectangular windows trimmed in dark green. They looked comfortable, not luxurious, but intentional, as if someone had designed them for rest, not for suffering. The prisoners slowed. One man muttered, "This isn't a camp, it's a joke." Another laughed, but it was dry, brittle. They didn't know what to make of it. No barbed wire wrapped the compound, no electric fences buzzed at the edges. Felix scanned the horizon, heart thudding. Where were the towers? Where were the dogs? Where were the reminders that they were enemies? A guard opened the door to one hut and motioned them in. Felix stepped through the threshold and froze. Inside, the light was softer, filtered through slatted windows. The air smelled faintly of oil and clean linen. Bunk beds stood in tidy rows, each with a folded blanket, a small pillow, and a wooden trunk at its base. The floor had been swept. A book, an actual book, rested on a shelf in the corner. There was a stove, a table, even a calendar tacked to the wall. He stood motionless. This wasn't a prison. It was housing, not for criminals, but for men. Human beings. He swallowed hard, the strangeness of it catching in his throat. The barracks at his training camp back in Germany had been worse, filthy, crowded, harsh. This hut felt like a boarding school in comparison. His skin prickled with confusion. The others filed in behind him, murmuring in low tones. One touched the blanket, then pulled his hand back as if burned. Another sat on the edge of the bunk and immediately stood again, guilt tightening his features. Felix walked to the window and looked out. No locks, no bars, just an open pane and the wide, wild Texas sky. He remembered the posters that had lined the walls back home, depicting Americans as beasts, as torturers in uniform, grinning over piles of bodies. He remembered a captain who said that capture by the Americans was a death sentence, that they'd skin you before they fed you. And yet, here he stood, his skin intact, the air thick with the smell of coffee and grass, surrounded by silence instead of screams. He sat down on the bed, slowly, almost reverently. The mattress gave under his weight like a sigh. His fingers dug into the fabric of the blanket. It was real. This place was real. And for the first time since the war began, Felix realized he didn't know what was true anymore. He sat in silence for what felt like an hour, letting the stillness of the hut wrap around him like gauze. Outside, boots crunched across gravel. Inside, the walls absorbed the quiet hum of the fan overhead. The air was dry but breathable. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Captivity was supposed to crush you, not offer you space to think. And maybe that was the danger, because now, in the absence of pain, memory began to flood in. Felix remembered the moment it ended, the war, at least for him. It was in northern Italy, near the edge of a vineyard, where the last orders had come through the radio in a frantic stutter. The squad scattered. Some dropped their rifles. One man fled into the trees and was never seen again. Felix had simply sat down on the slope, the red clay soaking into his trousers, and waited for the Americans. When they came, they didn't yell. They didn't even look angry. A sergeant with a scar across his chin told him to stand, and when he did, the man only nodded and took his sidearm. No spit, no punches, just quiet efficiency. But shame didn't need noise to take root. The surrender hung on him like a second skin, sour and sticky. In Germany, surrender wasn't failure. It was betrayal. At home, they had grown up hearing stories of heroes who died in snowbanks gripping empty rifles. His mother once wept while reading aloud from a newspaper about a machine gunner who'd held a position alone for 3 days before blowing himself up with his last grenade. That was what loyalty looked like. What did it mean that Felix had chosen to live instead? Then came the train, then the ship. Weeks of it. He still heard the creak of the iron hull, still smelled the sharp mix of diesel and salt. The crossing had been both endless and immediate, like falling asleep in darkness and waking to more darkness. The holds were crowded. The lights stayed on. Men coughed in their sleep. Some cried. Felix did neither. He counted bolts in the wall, then recounted them. They were told nothing. Rumors filled the silence. They were being taken to Alaska to work in mines, to the south, where they would be made into slaves for cotton fields. One man was certain they'd be sent to the Pacific, handed over to the Japanese. Each theory was worse than the last, and every whisper carried the same seed of dread. America would not spare them. When they arrived, docked under skies far too blue for war, the prisoners looked for cages. None came. They looked for chains. None were offered. Instead, buses. Cushioned seats, windows, a box lunch with something that tasted like actual meat. Felix remembered holding the sandwich and not eating it for an hour, just staring, waiting. And now this, a Quonset hut with a mattress, a calendar, a fan. Where was the barbed wire? Even as he thought it, he stood and walked back to the window to check again, certain he had missed it. But the view remained the same, a field of hard-packed dirt, a few distant fences for livestock, trees. A crow perched on a low post. There was no wire, no watchtower, only sunlight and the almost unbearable absence of threat. The disorientation was worse than any slap. If they had screamed at him, he would have known where to place his hate, but the Americans kept giving him silence, bread, and small freedoms. Every kindness sharpened the edge of the betrayal he had once feared from his enemies, but now feared more from his own beliefs. He returned to the bed and sat down again. The blanket was still warm. The war was over, but something deeper, something inside, was just beginning. Days passed in a rhythm so soft it felt unreal. Morning began with a bell, not a siren, not a whistle, but a small clang that echoed like a question across the camp. Felix would wake before it, already half alert in the moments before dawn, the heat rising early, the sun cutting in through the edge of the curtain some past prisoner had sewn from flour sacks. A curtain. It was the sort of detail he never thought would mean anything. Now it was everything. Privacy, softness, something human. He washed his face in cool water from a basin outside, lined up with the others, and received breakfast without shoving, without humiliation. Eggs, sometimes porridge, always coffee. Real coffee, though weak. He sipped it slowly, letting the bitterness anchor him. The days were structured but not oppressive. Work assignments rotated, kitchen duty, garden detail, laundry. Felix was sent to help repair fencing one week, not prison fencing, but a pasture boundary that kept local cattle from wandering into the camp's supply lanes. It was absurd, he thought, to be trusted near open fields. But they were. The guards were always there, but distant, watchful, not looming. You could forget them sometimes. Letters came in waves, sometimes delayed for weeks, but they came. Felix received one from his mother, her handwriting shaky, the ink faint, as though the words themselves were starving. She didn't mention his father. She didn't have to. Her words were polite, cautious, more formal than he remembered. She asked if he was warm enough, if he had shoes. He stared at the paper for an hour before writing back. "I have a bed, I have food, I don't understand it either." He signed only his name. What else could he say? The Quonset hut became familiar. The curved ceiling no longer looked alien but protective, like the belly of a ship carrying him somewhere unknown. Inside, objects began to gather like whispers. A clean blanket folded at the end of his bed. A Bible in German, well worn, passed from hand to hand. A chessboard made from cigarette cartons. One day, a Red Cross parcel arrived with chocolate, a razor, and something Felix hadn't touched in years, a harmonica. He didn't know how to play, but he held it anyway, turning it in his fingers like a fragile artifact. He pressed it to his lips once, lightly, and breathed out. The note that came was high, pure, and strange. The men around him looked up. One chuckled. Felix put it away. That sound, too light, too joyful, felt dangerous. Still, that night when the lights were low, he tried again. Just a few notes, not a song, a test. And for a moment, in that tin hut beneath a Texan sky, the sound didn't feel like music. It felt like something else, the suggestion of a world where beauty could exist without punishment. The men adapted in different ways. Some mocked the softness. One refused to sleep under the blanket, calling it a trick. But most, like Felix, adjusted slowly, with a kind of quiet disbelief. The civility was surreal. Guards nodded when they passed. Orders were given, yes, but without venom. Punishment wasn't shouted but written. Infractions meant loss of privileges, not beatings. A man who stole from the canteen was assigned latrine duty, not locked away. It was a world where order didn't have to mean violence. At first, this scared Felix more than any threat. Because if these men, his enemies, could build such a system, then what did that say about his? What did that say about everything he had believed in, fought for, saluted? He sat by the window one evening, watching the sun slip down behind the hills, and played a soft, wavering note on the harmonica. It trembled in the air like a secret. And for the first time, Felix didn't flinch. The next morning, that secret followed Felix to breakfast. It lingered in the smell of hot bread, in the clatter of trays, in the way the steam rose from boiled eggs and glistened off the tin pitchers of milk. He stood in line, as he did every day. But something inside him had shifted. He no longer saw food as just sustenance. It had become something loaded, almost weaponized. A quiet, daily contradiction. The loaf placed before him was soft, clean, unsliced. Real white bread. The kind his mother hadn't seen in years. The kind his sister used to dream of. He held it in his hands, too long, drawing glances. He didn't care. It felt heavier than it should have, as if history itself had been baked into it. That night he read his mother's latest letter again. "Your uncle trades soap for onions. We boil the peels and call it soup. Our neighbor's boy died last week. His cheeks were hollow as eggshells." She never mentioned the war directly, never blamed him, but her words pulsed with grief, unspoken accusations folded between each line. Felix folded the letter carefully and slid it under his mattress, though he could feel its weight pressing against him all night. To be fed, and fed well, was beginning to feel like betrayal. At first, hunger in captivity had been the expected enemy. They all braced for it, carried the fear of it in their bones. But when it didn't come, when, instead, they were given meat, beans, jam, butter, it became something else, a moral wound, a distortion. Felix had once read a story about a soldier who'd traded his boots for a loaf of bread in Stalingrad. His captain had beaten him to death for the dishonor. And yet here, the guards handed bread out like it was nothing. You could have seconds. Sometimes you didn't even have to ask. He found himself hesitating at mealtimes, not from hunger, but from guilt. He thought of his mother, scrubbing rations into a pot, watering down flour, her hands red from the cold. He imagined her reading his letters and wondering what he'd done to deserve food, warmth, survival. Did she believe he had sold something? Betrayed someone? Or worse, did she envy him? Some men in the camp grew silent at meals. Others laughed too loudly. One man hoarded crusts in his footlocker, dried them into hard wedges to send home, wrapped in cloth. Another gave his tray away each morning, choosing to fast. "My brother starves," he whispered once, "and I grow fat." Felix understood that too well. He'd begun losing interest in food, not because he wasn't hungry, but because he felt he didn't deserve it. And yet his body betrayed him. His skin healed, his strength returned. His stomach stopped growling in the middle of the night. One morning he caught his reflection in a polished spoon and barely recognized himself, cheeks fuller, shoulders less drawn. It was like watching a ghost come back to life in reverse. He wrote back to his mother, "They feed us here. I don't know why. But I think of you every time I eat. I don't enjoy it, I promise you that." He almost didn't send it, but eventually he folded it, sealed it, and handed it off. Then he returned to his bunk and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Food had become something more than nourishment. It was memory. It was confession. It was the sharp edge of a question he couldn't answer. Why did the enemy give me what my country would not? And every time he tore into a slice of bread, he felt it echo, through his teeth, down his throat, into the hollow place where loyalty used to live. The echo stayed with him as he stepped into the small wooden building tucked between the Quonset huts. At first glance, it looked like any other utility shed, maybe a storage room. But when the door swung open and the guard waved him in, Felix stopped in his tracks. Inside were shelves, real shelves, and on those shelves, books, dozens, maybe hundreds, some in English, others in German, leather-bound, dog-eared, paperbacks with torn covers. A copy of Goethe sat beside Of Mice and Men. A German atlas leaned against a volume of Mark Twain. He had expected rules, restrictions, signs saying verboten. Instead, a sergeant with wire-rim glasses simply said, "You can take 2 at a time. Just return them when you're done." He stood there, blinking. For a long time, he didn't move. It didn't make sense. In a place that was supposed to cage his body, they were giving him food for the mind. He didn't trust it, not at first. Most didn't. Some men laughed and walked out. Others suspected the books were traps, filled with American lies, twisted to break their spirits. Felix understood the fear, but he was also tired of suspicion, tired of silence. So he took a book. It was The Grapes of Wrath. The cover was cracked. The pages smelled like dust and pencil shavings. The English wasn't easy, but he tried anyway, pencil in hand, underlining words he didn't know. At night, under the low light of the hut's lamp, he read aloud in whispers. The story was slow at first. An American family, poor, struggling, but something in it gripped him. The dry desperation of it, the way men tried to protect their children from a world gone wrong. It wasn't the story that undid him. It was the realization. The enemy had stories too, and they weren't about victory or conquest. They were about hunger, about hope. Language began to feel different after that. English had once sounded sharp to his ears, foreign, blunt, like commands barked through a megaphone. Now he began to hear its rhythm, the way it danced between sorrow and sarcasm, how it could comfort or cut. He started practicing phrases, scribbling them in a small notebook made from scrap paper. He asked for a dictionary. He began translating lines back into German just to see what changed. It wasn't just about words. It was about seeing the world without a filter. Some men mocked him, said he was softening, said the books were poison. Others started reading too. Slowly, the library became a kind of church, a place to sit and ask questions no one dared to speak aloud. One afternoon, Felix found a copy of Democracy in America. The title alone felt like a challenge. He opened it, half expecting to find propaganda, chest-pounding declarations of moral superiority. Instead, he found a man quietly explaining the logic of law, the strength of institutions, the role of the individual in shaping society. He set the book down halfway through and just sat there, staring at the spine. These weren't the writings of savages. They weren't the tools of manipulators. They were thoughtful, complicated, and terrifying in their own way. Because the more he read, the more he felt something shift, not in the world, but in himself. He began to look at the guards differently, not with affection, not even with forgiveness, but with recognition. They weren't monsters. They were men, with their own stories, their own doubts. The enemy didn't just bleed. He read, he dreamed, he mourned. That night, as he sat by the window with Of Mice and Men open in his lap, Felix stared into the dark Texas sky and whispered a sentence under his breath in English. It came out halting, unsure, but it was his, and it was true. Felix closed the book and stared at the door of the hut. There was no lock. There had never been. Just a screen to keep the insects out, and a simple handle anyone could push open. He rose quietly and stepped outside. The sun was already climbing, the sky a sharp blue brushed with the high-pitched buzz of cicadas. Around him, the camp stirred. Men walked slowly between huts, laughing softly, passing cigarettes, some with towels slung over their shoulders on their way to the wash station. A group had already gathered at the soccer field, clearing rocks from the pitch. Someone shouted for a ball. The sound was not harsh. It was casual, familiar, ordinary. What struck Felix most was that no one had told them to do any of it. Discipline had become something voluntary here. No guards shouted morning orders. The men lined up at the canteen because they knew the food would be warm, and latecomers would get cold eggs. The chores weren't punishments. They were simply tasks, shared, rotated, understood. Clean your bunk, sweep the barracks, help wash the floors. And they did. Not because they were forced to, but because something in the rhythm of this place made cooperation easier than rebellion. There was a bulletin board outside the camp hall. On it, a neatly typed schedule: soccer matches, language classes, a drama group looking for volunteers to perform Faust. A watercolor exhibit was planned for the next Sunday. Felix stared at the page and blinked. Drama? Art? In a prison camp? But it was true. Inside the same Quonset huts where he once feared surveillance and humiliation, there were now sketches tacked to walls, charcoals of the landscape, pencil portraits of fellow prisoners. One was of a guard, done with surprising grace. The guard had laughed when he saw it and asked for a copy. He got it. Felix had never imagined cultural exchange looking like this. He had thought it would be pamphlets and loudspeakers. Instead, it was a harmonica solo after dinner. It was a group of German men singing an American folk song they had only just learned, laughing when the pronunciation tripped them. One guard sat in sometimes, showing them chord progressions on a battered guitar. They never talked about the war. They didn't have to. The music was the conversation. And then, slowly, the word enemy began to vanish from Felix's mind, not by force, but by erosion. At first, it had been replaced by guard, then man, then Thomas, Will, Lieutenant Grant. He began to recognize faces, habits, a guard who always whistled before breakfast, another who drew tiny cartoons on chalkboards. The distance narrowed, not enough to forget, but enough to humanize. Even the way prisoners spoke to one another changed. They no longer referred to themselves only by rank or role. Now it was Carl the cook, Matthias with the limp, Felix who reads American books. One afternoon during recreation, Felix sat under the shade of a pecan tree and watched a soccer game unfold across the dusty field. The players shouted in German and English, switching between the two without thinking. The guards leaned against the fence, not watching, just there. Felix realized he hadn't thought about escape in weeks. There was nothing to run from. His body was free within boundaries, yes, but his thoughts, his questions? They had already crossed whatever fences once stood. It wasn't peace, not yet. But it was something like the shape of it, and it was beginning inside the strangest place of all, a prison without chains, where a man could remember who he was, and begin to wonder who he might become. But not everyone wanted to become something new. For every man who embraced the quiet, who read American novels by lamplight or painted landscapes on scrap canvas, there was another who watched with narrowed eyes. The Quonset huts, once symbols of confusion, now divided the prisoners along invisible lines, those who adapted and those who resisted. Felix began to feel the shift in the dining hall. The laughter he once shared over harmonica tunes now sat uneasily in his throat. Glances lasted a beat too long. Conversations quieted when he passed. The hardliners called them replacements. Not traitors, exactly, but something worse. Men whose minds had been replaced by comfort. "They give you chocolate and you forget your country," one muttered. "They let you draw pictures while our people eat rats." Another accused a fellow prisoner of collaborating simply for accepting an extra ration of meat. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The shame was slower than insult. It sank into the bones like cold. Felix understood their anger. He didn't agree, but he understood. They came from the same soil, after all. They had believed in the same war once, or at least been swept along in its current. And now they sat on opposite sides of a silent border, one drawn not by geography, but by what a man chose to do with a pencil, a phrase in English, a piece of soft bread. For some, learning was liberation. For others, it was surrender. Books became battlegrounds. A few were stolen from the library and thrown into the latrine. Others simply disappeared, torn page by page and fed to the stove. Felix once caught sight of the red badge of courage half-burned behind the kitchen. No one confessed. No one had to. The message was clear. Stories were dangerous, especially those that made you feel something for the other side. Even the act of learning English became suspect. Guards never forced it, but the lessons were always there, open, optional, welcoming. Felix attended often. He listened closely, scribbled notes, practiced vowels late into the night. He wasn't fluent, but he was functional. He could think in it now, sometimes. He'd catch himself translating his own dreams, and yet each word he learned felt like a wedge, pushing him further from the past, from the village his mother still wrote from the boy who had once sworn to protect the Reich without question. There were nights he wanted to tear the notebook apart. But instead, he wrote more. Poems, mostly, nothing grand, just fragments. Images, a hand on a canteen, a face lit by firelight, a memory of a tree he had climbed as a child. The English was imperfect, but the meaning was sharp. He didn't show them to anyone. He didn't need to. The act of writing them was the confession, and each time his pencil touched paper, he felt a strange ache, not guilt, exactly, but something close. The shame of surviving when others hadn't. The shame of finding beauty where there should have been only bitterness. One morning, before roll call, he folded a slip of paper and tucked it into the seam of his mattress. It read, "They gave me bread, and I lost my sword. They gave me words, and I lost my rage. They gave me silence, and I found myself listening." He sat there for a long time, staring at it. Then he tucked it away again. The camp bell rang, clear and familiar, calling the men to another day inside a fence that no longer held them, but still marked who they were becoming. The bell rang again the next morning, but this time it carried something different in its tone. A ripple moved through the camp, like wind through tall grass, silent at first, then growing louder as whispers hardened into words. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. The Reich was gone. For a long moment, no one reacted. The men froze mid-step, spoons suspended over plates, eyes searching faces for confirmation. Then, somewhere down the row of Quonset huts, someone cheered, another cursed, and another fell to his knees, muttering a prayer that sounded more like an apology. Felix didn't move. He just sat on the bench outside the canteen, the sunlight slicing through the thin steam of his coffee. He wanted to feel something, relief, joy, even grief, but what came was nothing at all. The war that had shaped every second of his young life had ended without his help, without his witness. It was as though a great machine had simply shut down in the distance, leaving only the hum of insects in the Texas air. Inside the barracks, the news spread in uneven bursts. Some men cried openly, others laughed in hysteria, talking of going home, of rebuilding, of beer halls and family dinners that no longer existed. One man tore up a photo of Hitler and burned it in a tin can. Another picked up the ashes and wept over them. They were all displaced now, not just by geography, but by meaning itself. What did surrender mean to men who had already been prisoners? That night, the camp felt both quieter and louder than ever before. The guards didn't speak much, but their expressions had softened, as though they understood what this meant for those inside the huts. A few even offered cigarettes. "It's done," one said simply. "You can go home soon." Home. The word hit Felix harder than the news itself. He thought of his mother's letters, the shaky handwriting, the mentions of bombed-out houses, the silence about his father. He imagined returning to that wreckage, to streets without roofs, to faces hollowed by hunger. The idea of leaving these huts, these curved shelters of order and small mercies, filled him not with joy but dread. For all their strangeness, they had become the closest thing to peace he had ever known. Over the next days, they began preparations for repatriation. Each man was issued a small satchel and told to pack what he owned. Felix folded his spare shirt, his dictionary, his harmonica, and a handful of poems written on scrap paper. He hesitated over the books, Of Mice and Men, Faust, a copy of Leaves of Grass someone had loaned him. He couldn't take them all. In the end, he chose the Steinbeck, sliding it carefully beneath his blanket before rolling it into the bag. It wasn't a souvenir. It was a reminder of the man he had been allowed to become. The huts echoed with strange goodbyes. Men traded small keepsakes, drawings, lighters, pocket knives, as if unsure whether they were parting from friends or versions of themselves. One night, someone played a harmonica outside, the same thin melody Felix had once practiced. It wavered in the air like smoke, trembling but unbroken, and yet, amid the murmurs and the laughter, a question hung heavy in the air. What waited for them in the ruins of the Reich? Would the people who had endured starvation and bombing look at these well-fed, sun-browned men and see brothers or traitors? Felix didn't know. He only knew that leaving this place would hurt. Before we continue, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We read everyone, and if this story moved you, hit the like button, tap subscribe just below this video, and click the bell so you don't miss the next one. That's how we can keep making these stories possible. As dawn broke on the day of departure, Felix stood outside his hut for the last time. The sun rose over the Texas fields, gilding the metal roofs in gold. For months he had lived beneath them, waiting for freedom. Now, as he stared at the open road beyond the buses, he realized that freedom wasn't leaving. Freedom was the strange, painful clarity he carried inside him, the understanding that he no longer knew where home truly was. The train that carried Felix home moved slower than the one that had taken him away. It groaned through a landscape that no longer looked like a country, but like the bones of one. Germany was gray and silent, its rivers thick with debris, its villages half swallowed by weeds. From the window, Felix watched smoke rise from craters that had long gone cold. Churches were shells, their steeples jagged against the sky. Fields, once golden with wheat, were now patches of churned earth and twisted metal. Every mile erased another piece of the Germany he had known, and by the time the train hissed to a stop, he felt as though he were stepping off not into his homeland, but into someone else's dream. His old street was gone. Not damaged, gone. The row of houses where he'd learned to ride a bicycle was now an open wound of brick and ash. He found the spot where his home had stood by the shape of a broken fence post, still clinging to a rusted hinge. When he reached what had been the front garden, his boots sank into black dust. There were no flowers now, no fence, no door. Only emptiness, stretching in all directions. He stood there for a long time, unable to move. When he finally turned away, he saw his mother standing at the edge of the street, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, eyes wide with disbelief. "Felix?" she said, though it came out more as a question than a greeting. He barely recognized her. Her face had thinned, her hair turned white at the temples. She moved toward him, then stopped halfway, as though afraid he might vanish. When he reached for her, she touched his sleeve, not his hand. "You look well," she said softly. It wasn't a compliment, it was an accusation wrapped in wonder. Inside what was left of their neighborhood, life clung like mold to the ruins. People lived in cellars, in basements, in corners of bombed-out walls covered with tarps. Children played with shrapnel as if it were toys. His mother led him to a room beneath a collapsed bakery where a few families shared the space. A pot of watery cabbage stew simmered on a small fire. "We heard you were taken," she said, lowering herself to a stool. "We thought you might be dead." "I was in America," Felix said quietly. Her head snapped up. "America?" The word hung in the air like blasphemy. He nodded. "A camp in Texas." She stared at him, confusion flickering across her face, followed by disbelief. "They sent you there? And you lived?" He nodded again. "I lived." She looked at his skin, his clothes, the color in his cheeks. Her eyes filled with tears. "They fed you, didn't they?" He hesitated. "Yes." She turned away. "Your father is gone. He went looking for work after the last bombing. He never came back." Her voice was flat, like she had practiced saying it without breaking. "Your brother was taken east. I don't know if he's alive." Felix sat in silence, the harmonica heavy in his pocket. He wanted to tell her everything, the Quonset huts, the books, the laughter, the music, but each word felt like betrayal. How could he describe a camp without barbed wire to a woman who'd spent years hiding under rubble? How could he speak of clean blankets to someone who hadn't known warmth in years? That night, as they lay side by side on the cold floor, Felix stared at the cracked ceiling and realized the cruel truth. Survival had its own cost. The men who came back from America were strangers in their own land. Their bellies were full, their skin unmarked by hunger, and for that they carried a guilt heavier than any chain. He whispered once, in English, "I am sorry." But his mother didn't stir, and in that moment he understood. Some truths were too large to translate. Years passed like a slow tide pulling him forward, but the weight of that unspoken truth never washed away. Germany rebuilt itself brick by brick, yet everywhere Felix went, the ruins still whispered. He found work repairing railway lines, then later as a clerk in a small-town office. The rhythm of days returned, but it was a hollow rhythm, built on habit, not conviction. People spoke of victory and loss in the same breath, of rebuilding with pride, of never bowing again. But Felix kept his head down. He had bowed once, to survival, and that kind of surrender doesn't leave the bones easily. He never married. The years blurred together, the decades softening the outlines of what had once been sharp. But sometimes, in the stillness between paperwork and twilight, his mind drifted back to the Quonset huts of Texas, the strange, curved roofs gleaming in the sun, the smell of soap, the sound of laughter carried across an open field. Those memories came like ghosts, not of fear, but of dissonance. The war had taught him to see the world in black and white. America had painted it in shades of gray. One late afternoon, walking home from work, Felix passed a storage yard at the edge of town. A single round-roofed shed stood there, metal ribs arching just so, catching the light in a way that stopped him mid-step. It wasn't a Quonset hut, not exactly, but it was close enough to awaken something deep in his chest. He stood there in the road, frozen, the cold wind tugging at his coat, and suddenly he was 20 again, standing outside a hut in Texas, hearing a harmonica play in the dusk. The sensation was so vivid he could almost smell the pecan trees, feel the coarse fabric of his blanket, hear the clink of enamel cups in the canteen. But what struck him most was not nostalgia. It was the paradox of it all, that the place meant to contain him had given him freedom, and the country that claimed to be his salvation had turned into a graveyard of ideals. The war had taught him to hate, and the Americans, without meaning to, had taught him how to question. Their kindness had been a mirror, forcing him to see himself stripped of uniform and anthem. And what stared back was not the soldier he once was, but the man he might have been if the world had not burned. In the evenings he began writing again. He still kept his old notebook, the one he had carried across the ocean. Its pages were yellowed, the corners bent, but his handwriting, half German, half English, remained steady. He wrote not for anyone else, but for the ghosts that refused to leave him. He wrote about the smell of white bread, about books that should have been forbidden, about guards who smiled as though mercy were the most natural thing in the world. He wrote because forgetting felt like betrayal. Sometimes, when people in the town spoke of the war, of honor, of heroism, of vengeance, Felix would stay silent. He had seen too much of what war did to honor. He had seen dignity survive only in captivity. Memory, he decided, was its own form of rebellion, the quiet refusal to let the world simplify what had once been unbearably complex. That winter, as snow gathered on the eaves, Felix opened his notebook to a fresh page. He paused, staring out the window at the curved roof of the shed across the road, its outline fading into the fog. He thought of the camp's mornings, of men lined up under the Texan sun, unguarded and unchained. He thought of how the Americans had built shelters shaped not like prisons, but like open hands. And with slow, deliberate strokes, he wrote his final line. "They didn't need fences. We were already free."